At first, I thought it was some kind of bad joke. There I stood on my porch, coffee steaming in one hand, the morning paper in the other, when I noticed a garish orange paper taped right across my front door like a neon slap in the face. The bold, blocky letters screamed, "Notice of removal. Your unauthorized crops must be cleared within 14 days or legal action will be taken." I stared at it, blinking slowly, waiting for my brain to catch up. Maybe the caffeine hadn't kicked in yet, I thought. But sure enough, the words stayed the same no matter how many times I read them. The audacity of it all made me laugh out loud, one of those deep-bellied laughs I hadn't let out in months. Whoever had written this had no clue who they were dealing with. This farm wasn't some backyard garden. It was my family's legacy, leased federal farmland protected under agricultural preservation programs and part of a veterans' rehabilitation initiative. Whoever thought they could bully me into mowing down my crops clearly hadn't done their homework. But as the laughter faded, a different feeling settled in my chest, a slow, burning anger. Without realizing it, someone had just declared war. By noon, the town grapevine was buzzing louder than a hive in July. Word spread fast. The HOA president, Meredith Green, a woman whose voice could peel paint off a wall, had made the unilateral decision that my cornfields were an eyesore. The reason? She claimed the site of my crops, growing just outside the pristine white picket boundaries of their freshly built suburban development, was dragging down property values. I watched from my porch as Meredith paraded down the dirt boundary line, clipboard in hand, flanked by two of her most loyal board members. She wore designer sunglasses and a sun hat big enough to cover half the state, waving her arms like she was surveying her personal kingdom. Even from where I stood, I could hear her barking about unkempt wasteland and hazards to the children. Hazards to the children. She claimed that if kids wandered into the cornfield, they might get lost. As if my fields were some dark forest from a fairy tale. I half expected her to say there were wolves lurking between the rows. I couldn't help but laugh again, but this time it was sharper, tinged with disbelief. I stepped off my porch and walked slowly toward her, boots crunching on the dry dirt path. Meredith straightened immediately when she saw me coming, standing like she was preparing for a duel at high noon. Her two minions shifted nervously behind her, clearly unsure how this would play out. "Afternoon," I said evenly, keeping my voice calm. She clutched the clipboard tighter like it might shield her from common sense. Per HOA regulations, all landscaping visible from community roads must meet established standards, she announced, her words crisp and rehearsed. I raised an eyebrow. What standards apply to farmland that existed 70 years before your neighborhood was even a thought on paper? She didn't even blink. If it's visible, it's under our influence. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't someone I could reason with. Facts didn't matter to her. Only control did. I smiled, one of those slow, deliberate smiles you give a child who just told you they're going to build a spaceship in the backyard with duct tape and cardboard. "Ma'am, this land is leased through the Department of Agriculture under federal agricultural preservation programs. Not only are my crops fully authorized, but your HOA has no jurisdiction here." She waved my words away like a mosquito. "HOA policy is the highest authority in this area," she said, as if declaring herself queen. I could have argued more, but I knew better. People like Meredith didn't back down because of logic. They only back down when consequences make them. So instead, I simply said, "Touch one stalk of corn on my land, and I guarantee you'll be dealing with more legal consequences than you can imagine." But I could already see the glint in her eye. She thought I was bluffing. That evening, a folded piece of paper slipped under my door, invited me to an emergency HOA meeting scheduled for the next night. The agenda? A formal vote on whether my crops should be forcibly removed to preserve community standards. I stared at the letter, shaking my head at the absurdity. My land wasn't inside their neighborhood lines. It had never been, never would be. Yet here they were, playing lords and ladies, pretending they had any say over what happened on my farm. That night, as the sun sank low and painted the cornfields in gold, I made a quiet promise to myself. If Meredith wanted a fight, I'd give her one, but it would be on my terms, with the full weight of the law at my back. This wouldn't be a shouting match. It wouldn't be petty. It would be quiet, methodical, and absolute. And when it was over, everyone in this town would know exactly why you don't pick fights with farmers who know their rights. The next evening, as I pulled into the community clubhouse parking lot, I couldn't help but notice the contrast between my old, rusted truck and the sea of shiny luxury vehicles parked around it. A few of the neighbors glanced at me with a mix of curiosity and hostility, but I paid them no mind. They were about to learn that this wasn't a fight they could ignore. Inside the clubhouse, the atmosphere was tense. Folding chairs were lined up in front of a long table where the HOA board members sat, looking as uncomfortable as a group of kids on the first day of school. Meredith sat at the center, her smile plastered on her face, clearly enjoying the sense of power she had in the setting. She tapped her gavel on the table, calling the meeting to order with all the self-importance of a town dictator. "We are gathered here tonight to discuss the violation of community standards posed by the adjacent farmland," she announced, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. She had a poster board set up next to her with blown-up photographs of my fields. Red circles highlighted patches of corn, a few bales of hay, and random spots that looked more like a map to a treasure hunt than a legitimate complaint. I leaned against the back wall, folding my arms across my chest as I watched the spectacle unfold. Meredith listed off her so-called grievances: obstructed views, potential rodent infestations, depreciating property values. The whole thing was laughable, a collection of complaints strung together with no real evidence, only a desperate need for control. When she finally finished, she opened the floor to comments. A few brave homeowners spoke up, timidly asking whether the HOA even had the jurisdiction to manage land outside the official neighborhood borders. Meredith waved off their concerns with the kind of dismissive arrogance only she could muster. One older gentleman stood up, his voice shaky but determined. "Why is the farmland even there? What's the purpose of it?" That was my cue. I stood up, walking calmly to the front of the room, the eyes of every homeowner following my movements. The room fell into an expectant silence as I addressed them. "For the record," I said, my voice steady and clear, "the farmland in question is leased by the Department of Agriculture under a federal program for agricultural preservation and veterans support. It is legally protected land. Your HOA has no authority over it. In fact, you are currently engaging in harassment and attempting to violate federal property rights." The room went silent. Meredith blinked rapidly, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. I could see the wheels turning in her head as she tried to figure out how to save face. After a long, uncomfortable pause, she plastered on a condescending smile and replied sweetly, "Surely we can come to a neighborly agreement, can't we?" I smiled back, the kind of smile you give someone who has no idea what they're up against. "Absolutely. The agreement is simple. You leave my land alone or deal with the federal government." Her face turned a deep shade of red as she sputtered with indignation. "If you refuse to comply voluntarily," she declared, her voice trembling with barely contained rage, "the HOA will take steps to remove the offending crops themselves. And we'll bill you for the costs." I just nodded, unfazed. "Every action you take will be documented and forwarded to the Department of Agriculture and the county sheriff. You're welcome to continue with your plans. I'll make sure every step you take is legally accounted for." The room was now filled with murmurs of uncertainty, the faces of the residents shifting from curiosity to fear. As Meredith banged her gavel to close the meeting prematurely, I could feel the momentum of the battle shift in my favor. Walking out of the meeting, I noticed that many of the residents were looking at me with newfound respect, or maybe it was fear. They were beginning to realize the mess Meredith had dragged them into. By the time I returned home, the adrenaline had faded and I stood at the edge of the cornfield, the sunset casting a warm glow over the rows of crops. The next few days passed in an unsettling calm. Meredith sent me a certified letter, giving me one last warning. I framed it and hung it on the wall of my office. It was a reminder of how close she had come to making a mistake she couldn't undo. I called my contact at the Department of Agriculture, Brenda, who had been a huge help when setting up the land lease years ago. When I explained what was going on, Brenda burst into laughter. "That's the most ridiculous thing I've heard all week," she said, between chuckles. "Don't worry. I'll send an inspector out and we'll handle this. If they try to interfere with the land, we'll have them for criminal trespassing and fines. You're in the right on this one, no doubt." By the time Brenda sent the inspector and the sheriff's deputies, I had gathered enough evidence to put Meredith in a position she couldn't escape. But Meredith, of course, wasn't done yet. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I saw movement along the far side of the field. I grabbed my binoculars and peered through the glass. There, creeping along the fence line, were a couple of Meredith's cronies carrying measuring tapes and surveying equipment. They looked like toddlers pretending to play grown-up with real tools. I watched them for a while, knowing it would only make things worse for them. But then, that night, the real action started. My motion detectors pinged, and when I checked the footage, I saw something much more interesting, Meredith herself sneaking onto my land under the cover of darkness. She was carrying a can of spray paint and a handful of orange flags. She planted the flags haphazardly through one section of the corn, marking the land like it was her own personal property. I grabbed the footage, sent it to Brenda and the sheriff's office, and waited for their next move. The following morning, as the first workers arrived with heavy-duty equipment, I knew the moment had come. It was time to end this nonsense. I called the sheriff again. By the time the sheriff's cruiser rolled up, half the neighborhood had gathered to watch the spectacle. Meredith stood at the front of the workers, barking orders like she was running a military operation. But when the sheriff stepped out of his vehicle, things took a sudden turn. He marched straight to Meredith and patiently listened to her explain her nonsensical complaints about property values and aesthetics. Then, without any fanfare, he placed her under investigative detention. Meredith's face drained of color as she realized she was in serious trouble. The workers who had been following her orders immediately stopped, dropping their tools like hot potatoes. The sheriff took the evidence, the footage, the documents, and promised that things would be dealt with swiftly. As Meredith was led away for questioning, I tipped my hat to her, silently bidding her farewell. She had set the wheels of this war in motion, and now she was bound to feel the full consequences of her actions.